Gather round the fire, folks, and let me tell you a tale that'll make your blood run cold. It's a story that'll make you question the depths of human depravity and the darkness that can lurk within even the most ordinary of places. It was September 25th, 1991, and a carnival in the town of Auburn, Indiana, was shutting down for the night. As the lights slowly dimmed and the rides ground to a halt, a group of carnies had something far more sinister planned than just packing up and heading home. Now, I know what you're thinking. Carnies are a little bit weird, sure, but they're just regular folks trying to make a living, right? Well, let me introduce you to the ringleaders of this twisted tale: Jimmy Lee Pennick, Mark Goodwin, and brothers Keith and David Lawrence. These guys weren't your run-of-the-mill carnies. They were part of a satanic cult, and they were about to commit an act so heinous, so gut-wrenchingly brutal, that it would shake even the most hardened of souls. This group had this fixation on Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, and they were hell-bent on gaining power through ritual sacrifice. And who better to sacrifice than a young, innocent soul who just wanted to be part of their twisted little group? Now, who was this poor soul? His name was William Anthony Tony Altz, and he was only 21 years old. A sweet, sensitive guy. Tony was just looking for a sense of belonging, a group of friends to call his own. Little did he know that the friends he sought were about to commit an act of unspeakable cruelty. On that fateful night, Tony joined the group, and they lured him to a secluded farm outside of Auburn, under the guise of initiating him into their twisted rituals. Little did Tony know that this initiation would be a one-way ticket to a fate worse than death. As Tony lay on a makeshift altar, bound and gagged, Keith Lawrence began reciting some sort of satanic spell or prayer. And then, without warning, Jimmy Pennick whipped out a knife and sliced open Tony's body from neck to groin in a deep, agonizing cut. But they weren't done there. The Lawrence brothers took it a step farther, carving inverted crosses into Tony's torso and abdomen, slicing him open like a sacrificial lamb. And as Tony lay there, bleeding and suffering, Jimmy Pennick leaned down and asked him if he was ready to die. And with a swift slice to the throat, Jimmy Pennick ended Tony's life. But the nightmare was far from over. These monsters, these so-called Satanists, proceeded to dismember Tony's body, cutting off his head and hands, and even attempting to burn the remains. They buried what was left of him in a shallow grave, as if discarding a piece of trash. And then they had the audacity to call their friend Brenda Ferguson to pick him up, as if nothing happened. And here's the kicker. After committing this unspeakable act, these monsters stopped at an Arby's and paid for their food with money stolen from Tony's pockets. But the true horror doesn't end there. See, this wasn't Jimmy Pennick's first rodeo when it came to ritual sacrifice. In fact, just a few months earlier, he had committed another brutal murder, slicing a man's throat in the same agonizing fashion. And as far as the rest of the group, well, let's just say they had their own sordid pasts and twisted motivations. Mark Goodwin, for instance, had been obsessed with Satanism since he was a mere child, forming his own cult called Satan's Disciples at the ripe old age of 15. The Lawrence brothers were no saints either. Keith, in particular, had a history of violence and aggression, even going so far as to chase his own brother, David, around with a kitchen knife over his refusal to join the cult. These monsters thought they could get away with their heinous crimes, that they could simply go about their lives as if nothing had happened. Little did they know that the walls were closing in, and their web of lies and deceit was about to unravel in spectacular fashion. It all started when Keith Goodwin's own father caught wind of the gruesome act his son had witnessed. Can you imagine the anguish, the disappointment a father must feel when he learns that his own flesh and blood has been party to such a despicable crime? With a heavy heart, he did the only thing a decent human being could do. He picked up the phone and called the police, setting into motion a chain of events that would bring these sadistic killers to justice. On December 12, 1991, just a few months after Tony's murder, the hammer finally dropped. Jimmy Pennick, Mark Goodwin, and the Lawrence brothers found themselves in handcuffs, their twisted charade finally exposed. And as the investigation unfolded, the true depths of their depravity became painfully clear. The dismembered remains of poor Tony's body, including his severed head and a burned hand, were discovered by a group of unsuspecting deer hunters. But even in the face of overwhelming evidence, these monsters showed no remorse, no shred of humanity. Jimmy Pennock, the ringleader himself, admitted to the entire sordid affair without batting an eye, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a brutal murder. Mark Goodwin, too, confessed to witnessing the entire ordeal and even lightly participating, as if there's such a thing as lightly participating in torture and dismemberment. The Lawrence brothers, those twisted siblings, tried to play it cool, jetting off to the Bahamas for a sunny vacation while the heat was on. But their little island getaway was cut short when they were promptly extradited back to Indiana to face the music. During the trial, even more sordid details emerged, like the fact that Keith Lawrence had tried to cut out Tony's still beating heart, and that Jimmy Pennock had instructed him to remove Tony's head so he could give the skull to a friend as some sort of sick souvenir. In the end, justice was served, but not without a bitter aftertaste. Jimmy Pennock received 60 years in prison after pleading guilty to aggravated murder to avoid a possible death penalty. Now in his late 50s, he is still serving that lengthy sentence for his role as the ringleader who slit Tony's throat. Mark Goodwin pled guilty to assisting the crime and got 8 years. After his release, he supposedly found religion, but his remorse seemed hollow. Keith Lawrence, at age 20, during the murder, got 50 years, with 20 suspended for conspiracy to commit murder. He was released from prison in 2004, but violated parole and went back briefly in 2006. His brother, David Lawrence, who claimed he only went along with it, pled guilty to assisting the crime and received 8 years as well. He claimed he would never speak to Keith again after this. So while Jimmy Pennock remains locked up for now, the other 3 perpetrators have basically been freed back into society after disgracefully short prison sentences that in no way seemed fitting for their roles in Tony Alt's brutal torture and death. The town of Auburn, Indiana, and the surrounding areas were no doubt forever scarred by this senseless act of depravity committed by the Carni Cult.